Hi everyone, this is Dr. Mike, host of the free iTunes podcast Psychiatric Secrets Revealed with Dr. Mike, but that's not why I'm here today. This is another Saving Savvy episode, this time talking about a camera, the Nikon P7000. Now I know what you're saying, well that was last year's camera, there's now a P7100, but the reason I want to talk about this camera is because it's become a very good value. The camera I think originally was selling for about $450. Nowadays, you can get the camera for about anywhere from $220 to $270, depending on where you look or if you're willing to take a refurb or not. And this camera is not that different from the 7100. In fact, they have a firmware upgrade that improves the focus, which is one of the big complaints about this camera. So now the focus is much better than what it was before. And the only difference between this camera and the 7100, well, there's a couple. One, there's a few layout changes that are pretty minor. There is the back display is the same, but it now can flip out if you want to do that. Again, it says it's a little bit faster, but the sensor is the same, the lens is the same, and so you get essentially the same quality of images. They do say it has a different processor inside, so maybe low light images might be slightly better. From all the reviews that I've seen, it says images are about the same. So to look at this camera, we really need to understand a little bit more about cameras in general. So this is really, this part of the discussion is for those people that really are maybe thinking about upgrading a camera but don't know a lot about cameras. I'm going to divide cameras into three general categories. First, we have our cell phone cameras. Now, most cell phones take average to poor pictures. This particular cell phone has an 8 megapixel sensor, and it has autofocus, and it has a little flash, but the images really don't look that great. They're okay. Why is that? Because the lenses are fairly, or the lens system is fairly cheap, and the little sensor, even though it's 8 megapixels, is really, really, really tiny, and that usually leads to poor quality pictures. So cell phones are on this end of the spectrum. Let's now look at the top end of the spectrum, and that would be cameras that have very large sensors, and that would include things like micro four thirds cameras or DSLR type cameras, and a whole variety of different cameras that have typically very high quality lenses and very big sensors. So those cameras give you the most definition, they give you the best low light performance, the lowest noise performance. They're generally just great cameras, but they tend to be expensive. And in between, you have cameras like this. This is a little digicam or point and shoot, if you like to call it that, or just a very simple camera. But this particular camera, this just represents one of many. They tend to be relatively inexpensive, but they have a much better lens system than our cell phone. They also have a much larger sensor, although the sensor is still pretty small, than our cell phone. And so generally speaking, these cameras are going to take much better pictures, and for most people, this type of camera works out just fine. It's small, it's convenient, they can take it anywhere, and that's great. So where does the P7000 fit in? Obviously, it's much bigger than our little digicam, right? But although I don't have an example here, it's much smaller than, let's say, a DSLR. So what is it? Well, really, what it is it's a digicam on steroids. So in other words, if someone wanted to make the best possible digicam that they could, this would be an example of that type of a camera. And so these types of cameras, along with cameras like the Canon G12, are really designed for the photo enthusiast who wants an extra camera. So although these will do all the automatic things that the digicam will do, they're just loaded with extra features that makes them a little more desirable for the person who really likes to take pictures and likes to make a lot of adjustments and things. So a person who might want to go on vacation and not take their big, bulky, super large DSLR, or perhaps someone who wants an extra camera in their pack to take with them in case there's a malfunction with their main camera, that sort of thing. This camera comes in very, very handy. Again, it's sort of a direct competitor to the Canon product, which is the G12. Most people would say that the G12 is a better overall camera, but most people would also say that the image quality is identical. And why would they, or pretty much identical? Why would they say that? Because both this camera and the G12 use the exact same sensor. It's a Sony sensor. It's 10 megapixels, which you think, well, like this camera here is 14 megapixels, right? But more pixels doesn't always mean better quality pictures. This is 10 megapixels, and the sensor is a bit larger than what you would find in a normal digicam. So a bigger sensor means typically better pictures. The other thing that they did with this camera is they've included a pretty large zoom for a point and shoot. This is a, I don't know if I can get it going. I never get these things going right. This is a 7.1x zoom, so you get a lot of zoom range in your camera. So this really functions as an all-in-one unit, and the quality of the lens in this camera is going to be better than your typical point and shoot. And the image stabilization on this camera is going to be better than your typical point and shoot. And what that means is just really better quality pictures, especially if you're hand holding it and you're trying to take pictures in adverse conditions like a dark area, or at dusk or something like that. The other thing that you might want to note about this camera is it is a nice big 3-inch display. That display has over 900,000 dots, so it's much clearer than you're going to see on most digi cameras. It also has an optical display. Now this display only shows 80% of what you're actually taking photo-wise, and so because of that, the display is of only marginal use. However, if you want to conserve battery life, or maybe you just like to hold it up to you because it's too bright outside, at least you can kind of point the camera in the right direction. Where this camera excels is all of the manual functions that are readily accessible on the back and on the top. So yes, again, of course it has all the automatic functions and all the scene modes and things like you'd expect with a digicam, but you can also select for things like shutter speed, aperture, full manual control, and it does those things very, very, very well. You also have user options where you can set the camera up, let's say, to certain parameters before you leave the house. Maybe you're going to take pictures of fireworks and you want to try various parameters. Well, instead of trying to fool around with making all those adjustments on the spot, you can preset them into these user options and just try 1, 2, or 3 and see which one works best. So that's a very, very cool function. One of my favorite things about this camera is that your exposure control is right here on the camera as a dial. And I'm going to show you some pictures where that's useful, but it's really nice to have it here when you're dealing with backlit situations, and you can easily make an adjustment right there and take care of that so you get a proper exposure. And they also have a quick axis wheel here, which allows you to kind of save some steps by not going through so many menu steps. So you have all different sorts of things, like you can adjust the ISO or the quality of the picture or the white balance or bracketing and things, and just click it here. It takes you right to that feature on the menu. So it saves some steps, makes it just a little bit easier, a little more user friendly. Another thing that makes this more professional is that instead of just having a click dial here, this dial also rotates. So you have a control dial here and you have a control dial here. And by having those two control dials, you can make much more rapid adjustments than you would, for instance, with certainly with a camera like this where you're digging through the menus and trying to figure out what you're about to do. So it's all about image quality, and I'm going to show you some images. But generally what I would say about this camera is, for a point and shoot camera, the image quality is excellent. It really, really is excellent. Now, if you're going to compare this to, for instance, a DSLR camera with that much bigger sensor and the ability to get really elaborate and expensive lenses, no, this camera is not going to be as good as one of those cameras. But comparing it to something like this, it really does an amazing job taking great, great pictures. And in fact, the funny thing is that this particular camera has features that you don't even find in entry-level DSLRs. And in this case, I'm comparing this camera to, let's say, the D3000, which is one of the Nikon DSLRs. It's also a 10 megapixel camera, again, a much bigger sensor, so their 10 megapixels are going to be better than these 10 megapixels. But certain things that this camera has that camera doesn't have at all would include things like bracketing. So you can take, and all different sorts of bracketing, but for instance, you can do exposure bracketing where you take the picture at a normal exposure and then overexposed and then underexposed and then combined those various images in your computer to show a lot more detail and depth and to really see between the light and the dark and get a much better picture. This camera also has in it, which you're not going to find in your entry-level DSLR, a horizon, kind of an artificial horizon. So if let's say my pencil is the horizon, you're going to see this on the viewfinder. If I have my camera tilted a little bit one way or another, it's going to show me that tilt so I can get a straight picture. And I'm one of those people that I'm always taking crooked pictures for some reason. They look straight to me, but how great would it be if I wanted to do a landscape or something where I wanted this big expansive sort of view, if I could use that horizon to make sure that I was doing everything correctly. This also has a neutral density filter in it. What that neutral density filter allows is that it's sort of like putting sunglasses on your lens. And there are some instances where you actually want to reduce the light sensitivity of the camera. For instance, let's say I wanted to use a very wide aperture, merely have the camera's lens opened up really wide, but I was outside. And I couldn't really compensate for that, but I wanted that wide aperture to have a shallow depth of field. Well, I can add this neutral density filter, which is built into the camera, and reduce the sensitivity of the camera and actually get that shot that I wanted. And many more features, things that you would find in their DSLRs. You can look online for the manual, but just to let you know that it's a very sophisticated camera. A couple other things to point out. The lens in this camera starts at an aperture of 2.8. That's considered a fast lens, which means that the lens will operate, you'll be able to operate with lower light. Now, it's not super fast, but it's a faster lens than what you're going to typically find on a regular Digicam. It also has this poppy-uppy flash here, and this flash, of course, is not super powerful, but it is more powerful than you're typically going to find on a little point and shoot. So it's going to give you a lot more range when you're taking a picture. If you need more, the cool thing is if I can, I don't know if I can get this off with right now when I'm filming. Yes, here we go. It has a real genuine hot shoe. And that hot shoe, if you put a Nikon flash on the camera, will actually allow the camera and the flash to communicate with each other, and you can now have a much greater flash or do special things like bounce flash and things that you would do normally with a DSLR. So it's a very functional camera. Even the battery is bigger, allowing you to take more shots. What's this guy made of? Initially I thought it was made out of some sort of special metal, but I think it's just really plastic. But it has a very durable feel. It's much bigger, so it's not pocketable. But you need that bigger size because you need all these knobs and things to control, and a bigger size sometimes works better for those situations. So again, would I recommend this camera, especially with the 1.2 firmware? I would. And would I say that you should get this camera if this is your first camera ever? I'd be a little leery about that simply because it is so complicated, and you might do better with just a nice point and shoot, or even with their entry level, like the entry level DSLRs by Nikon, or I'm sure Canon too, where they're really designed to have a lot less controls on the surface, which makes them a little less intimidating. But this would be great for the enthusiast looking for a second camera, or for the emergency camera for the professional in their backpack. Awesome pictures, great price. Remember, it's almost the same as the 7100, and which is selling for about $450. I got this camera for about $220 something, and you certainly can find cameras at this camera for $270, $250, $220, depending on what you're willing to buy. In other words, refurb or new or that sort of thing. So thumbs up for the Nikon P7000, and if you're looking for a camera with these qualities, you can get one at a bargain price right now. Okay, here you see a handheld picture done in full automatic of a birthday cake. Too many candles to count. But what's nice is that it did a nice job filming this cake, and also you don't see a lot of background noise. And here's the recipient of the cake. That's me. I know, way too many candles. It did overexpose the candles, but it did properly expose me. This is a flash shot, and I think overall the balance was just fine. Now when it has to deal with this large white card, it tends to properly expose the card and not me. I'm sure this could have been corrected a little bit if I would have done some of the bracketing or maybe a little manual, but this was again held by my daughter. Just kind of shows you that like any other camera, its ability to adjust exposure is limited. If I use a smaller white card and there's more just general person, you see that the balance of the exposure is a lot more correct. And this is an interesting shot. The camera has a low light mode, and that uses only 3 megapixels, but it does a very nice job. This was in a pretty low light setting in a theater, and then when I switched to the scene mode for low light, which is actually 10 megapixels, you can see it didn't look quite as good. So that low light mode really does have some benefits. Here's just a shot of the theatrical performers. Actually, this is my daughter, and she was a Oompa Loompa, which is why she has green lipstick on. But you can see the colors are nice and vivid, and this was a flash picture too. Here's another picture of my grandson. Flash, nicely balanced, not blown out. Generally looks pretty good. I like this shot because it shows the benefit of using that exposure wheel on the top of the camera. So he was very strongly backlit, but just by going and adjusting the exposure directly and very easily with that knob, I was able to get a nice shot. And this is the flash again. He looks like he's nicely exposed, as does the cake and pretty much everything. So the camera did a nice job here. A couple of my kids with the flash shot. Again, you don't see a lot of flash burn. You can see the flash in the background behind my daughter's head, but overall the exposure is good and natural and soft. Here's just an outdoor shot. I was taking a couple of those just to see how the camera performed. Nice and clear, very kind of what you'd expect, nothing spectacular. And I know this tree is off center, but again, not a lot of fringing that I could see. Nice clear shot, and did a nice job with just really, again, very simple auto exposure. Here's a shot using the telephoto lens, and looks just fine to me. And this was this building was very strongly backlit. So here again, just using that exposure dial, just adjusting a little bit right on top of the camera, not having to go into the menu. I think we got a reasonable exposure here. Now this is pretty gross. This was from one of my son's science experiments. These are mealworms. They're larvae of beetles. You get them at any pet store, or sometimes you get them at bait shops. But this is the macro function using the onboard flash, and you can see that it did a nice job with the macro function, and it really didn't overexpose those gross looking little mealworms at all. Another outdoor shot just to show you that it does a pretty good job. This was well balanced. And that's it. Well, that's my review of the Nikon P7000, last year's camera, but at a great, great price. If you have some time, please give my podcast a listen. It's called Psychiatric Secrets Revealed with Dr. Mike. It's free. It's on iTunes. Completely different than this type of a venue, but I think you might enjoy it. Take care.